Teresa Halbach was 25 years old. She had a camera she carried everywhere. She was building something, a life, a career. And on October 31st, 2005, Halloween, she drove onto a property in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, and was never seen alive again. What happened to her in those final hours is something we still, genuinely, do not have a clean answer to.
And by the time this video is over, I think you're going to feel the same discomfort I felt when I went down this rabbit hole. Because this case is not what Netflix told you it was. It's not what the prosecution told you either. It's messier than both of those things. And the mess is the whole point. Stay with me. Let's start where nobody starts, with her.
Teresa Ann Halbach grew up in Hilbert, Wisconsin. Small town, Catholic family. She was described by basically everyone who knew her as genuinely warm, not in that polished, performative way, but the kind of warm where people just felt comfortable around her immediately.
She graduated from St. Norbert College in 2001 with a degree in photography, and she didn't waste time. She started building a freelance photography business, and one of her steadiest clients was Auto Trader magazine. She photographed cars for listings. It was not glamorous work, but it paid and it gave her freedom. She drove a dark green Toyota RAV4. She kept detailed planners. She was organized. She was dependable. Her colleagues knew that if Teresa said she was going to be somewhere, she was going to be somewhere. And on October 31st, 2005, her planner showed one appointment, a visit to the Avery salvage yard in Manitowoc County, a routine job. She'd been there before, multiple times. She knew the property.
She made that drive. And then her phone went silent. Her camera stopped, and Teresa Halbach ceased to exist in any record we can trace. When she didn't come home that night, her roommate and family assumed maybe she'd stayed out for Halloween. But by November 3rd, when she still hadn't appeared and her car hadn't moved from wherever it was parked, her friends started making calls. Then the calls turned into a search. And the search is where this story becomes something else entirely.
Here's where I need you to pay attention, because the timeline of what was found and who found it is genuinely strange. The Avery salvage yard, officially called Avery Auto Salvage, sits on 40 acres in rural Manitowoc County. It's run by the Avery family. And when a search party of volunteers and law enforcement started combing the property looking for Teresa on November 4th and 5th, 2005, her RA4 was found on the property, partially hidden, partially covered with branches.
Inside, investigators found Teresa's camera equipment, some of her personal items, and a key to the RAV4. Blood was also found inside the vehicle, later confirmed to be Teresa's. Then, on November 8th, after Steven Avery had already been named as a suspect, human bones were found in a burn pit behind his residence on the property. Those bones were eventually identified as Teresa Halbach's remains. And I know what some of you are already thinking. Okay, her remains are on his property, her car is on his property, open and shut. Except, no, because here is where the case starts to fracture. The key to Teresa's RAV4, the one found in Avery's bedroom, was not found on the first search of that room. It was not found on the second search. It was found on the sixth search of that room, lying in the open on the floor by a Manitowoc County detective who legally should not have been involved in the investigation at all.
Why should he not have been involved? Because Steven Avery had, just 2 years prior, filed a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County for wrongful conviction. He had spent 18 years in prison for a rape he did not commit. DNA evidence exonerated him, and he was suing the county and specific officers within that county for what they did to him. And those same officers were now the ones searching his property.
Manitowoc County was supposed to be recused. The investigation was handed to the Calumet County Sheriff's Department. But Manitowoc officers kept showing up. I kept finding things. Does that prove a frame-up? No. Does it mean every piece of evidence is tainted? Also no. But it means you cannot look at this case with clean eyes and say the process was clean, because it wasn't. The process was contaminated from the start, and we need to sit with that before we go anywhere else.
Let's talk about the physical evidence, because this is where people dig in and stop listening to the other side. Avery's DNA was found under the hood latch of Teresa's RAV4, not inside the car, under the hood. The swab was taken by a Manitowoc County officer. The defense argued that this was the easiest piece of evidence to plant, a single swab, a single sample, taken by someone who had every reason to want Avery convicted.
The prosecution argued that Avery had no scratches or cuts on his hands that would suggest a struggle, so the blood found inside the car, his blood, must have been planted from a blood sample that was collected from a previous case and stored in the courthouse. The defense pointed out that the vial of stored blood had a small puncture hole in the rubber stopper, suggesting someone had accessed it with a needle. The FBI analyzed that vial and said the puncture hole was consistent with the original collection process, and that EDTA, a preservative used in stored blood, was not found in the blood at the crime scene.
Both sides took that result and declared victory, and that is not me being sarcastic. The prosecution said, see, no EDTA, the blood wasn't planted from the vial. The defense said, the FBI test wasn't sensitive enough to detect low levels of EDTA, and the absence of a finding is not proof of absence. I'm not going to tell you who's right. I genuinely don't know, and anyone who tells you they know for certain is selling you something.
Now, the bones. Teresa's bones were found in multiple locations, primarily in the burn pit behind Steven Avery's trailer. But fragments were also found in a burn barrel on the property associated with his nephew, Brendan Dassey. And other fragments were reportedly found at a quarry near the property, though that detail got very little airtime in the documentary. The presence of bones in multiple locations is something the defense pointed out as inconsistent with a single murder scene. Why would remains be scattered? The prosecution argued Avery moved them deliberately to hide them.
And then there's the bullet. A bullet fragment containing Teresa's DNA was found in Avery's garage in March 2006, months after the initial searches. It was found by a Manitowoc County officer. The defense noted that the bullet showed no signs of having passed through flesh, no biological material embedded in the jacket of the slug, which forensic experts said you would expect to find if that bullet had traveled through a human body at close range. Again, the prosecution said the conditions could explain the absence. The defense said the bullet was planted.
Here is what I can tell you with confidence. The physical evidence in this case has a chain of custody problem. Not because every piece of it was faked. It's not a conspiracy theory. That's just what the record shows. Okay, we need to talk about Brendan.
Brendan Dassey was Steven Avery's nephew. He was 16 years old at the time of Teresa's murder. He had a documented learning disability. His IQ was assessed at around 70. He was, by multiple accounts, a kid who struggled to follow conversations, who was easily led, who wanted people to like him. In February 2006, investigators questioned Brendan without his mother present, without an attorney, for hours. And over the course of several interrogations, Brendan gave a confession that described in graphic detail participating in Teresa's rape and murder alongside his uncle. That confession is the most disturbing thing in this entire case, not because of what it describes, though that is horrifying, but because of how it was obtained. Watch the interrogation tapes. I mean, actually watch them, not the Netflix edit, the full tapes, which are publicly available. Investigators feed Brendan details. They correct him when his story doesn't match what they want to hear. They tell him things will be okay if he just tells the truth, implying that telling the truth means confirming their version of events. When Brendan gives details that contradict the physical evidence, the investigators don't stop and re-examine the evidence. They push him to change his story. At one point, Brendan describes Teresa being stabbed and her throat being cut inside Avery's trailer. No blood evidence consistent with that was ever found in the trailer. When investigators asked him about this inconsistency, months later, Brendan said maybe they cleaned it up. The physical evidence from the trailer did not support the graphic scenario Brendan described, at all. In 2016, a federal judge overturned Brendan's conviction, ruling that his confession was coerced and involuntary. The state appealed. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that ruling on procedural grounds. Brendan Dassey remains in prison to this day. He was convicted almost entirely on that confession, a confession that a federal judge found to be unconstitutional. I want to be very clear here, because I think people sometimes miss this. Saying Brendan's confession was coerced is not the same as saying he wasn't there. It's not the same as saying he's innocent. What it means is that we cannot trust what he said in that room as a reliable account of what actually happened, because the people in that room shaped what he said. And if we can't trust the confession, we have a gaping hole at the center of the prosecution's case.
Here's the part where I'm supposed to give you a theory, a clean answer, a resolution. I'm not going to do that. Because the honest answer, and I know this is unsatisfying, is that we do not know with certainty what happened to Teresa Halbach on October 31st, 2005. We know she went to the Avery property. We know she died. We know her remains were found there. We know the investigation was compromised. We know the confession that put a 16-year-old in prison was, at minimum, deeply problematic.
What we don't know is the sequence. What we don't know is whether the evidence against Steven Avery was real, planted, or some combination of both. What we don't know is whether there were other people on that 40-acre property. It was a working salvage yard with multiple family members living on it, who may have been involved and were never seriously investigated. The defense, during trial, pointed to Teresa's ex-boyfriend as someone who had access to her voicemails and who behaved oddly in the days after her disappearance. That avenue was not pursued by investigators. The defense also pointed to two of the Avery family members, names I'll let you look up, as potential alternative suspects who were never put under serious scrutiny. Did those individuals do it? I don't know. I'm not saying they did. What I'm saying is that investigators locked onto Steven Avery very early, and once they did, the investigation largely stopped looking elsewhere. That's a problem regardless of whether Avery is guilty. Tunnel vision in criminal investigations is not rare. It's actually depressingly common. And when you add a $36 million lawsuit and county officers who had personal stakes in the outcome, tunnel vision becomes something more troubling than mere incompetence. Something happened to this story that I think Teresa's family has talked about, and that I think it's lost every time someone makes a documentary or a podcast or a YouTube video about it. Teresa Halbach became a footnote. She became the victim in a story about Steven Avery's potential innocence, or she became the justification for why Steven Avery had to be guilty. Either way, she became a function of someone else's narrative, and she was a person.
Her family has been largely private. They've made statements over the years expressing frustration that Teresa's memory is constantly dredged back up in service of arguments that have nothing to do with who she was. Her brother Mike Halbach made a statement after Making a Murderer aired, expressing that sentiment, that the show didn't represent their experience of the case and that they believed the right person was convicted. I'm not dismissing that. I'm not going to tell a murder victim's family that their belief is wrong. They lived through this. They sat through the trial. They know things we don't.
But I also don't think the unresolved questions about the investigation disappear because the family wants them to. Those are separate things. You can believe Teresa's family deserves peace and simultaneously believe that the legal process that produced Avery's conviction was flawed in ways that matter. Both of those things are true at the same time. Steven Avery is currently serving a life sentence. His attorney, Kathleen Zellner, one of the most successful wrongful conviction attorneys in the country, someone who has exonerated 21 people, has been fighting his case for years. She has filed multiple post-conviction motions arguing new evidence points to different perpetrators. Those motions have, so far, not resulted in a new trial. Brendan Dassey is also still in prison, still fighting. The Manitowoc County officers who were at the center of the conflict of interest questions have faced no professional consequences related to this investigation.
Teresa Halbach's case is technically solved, officially closed with Avery's conviction. But solved and answered are not the same word. And if you've spent any time actually inside the documents of this case, the police reports, the lab results, the interrogation transcripts, you know that answer is not what this case is. There are people who are absolutely certain Steven Avery is guilty. There are people who are absolutely certain he was framed. I've spent a lot of time reading what both sides have written, and I'll tell you what I actually think. I think the truth is somewhere in the wreckage of a corrupt investigation and an underfunded defense, and a confession that never should have been admitted.
I think Teresa Halbach deserved a clean investigation, one without conflicts of interest, without a compromised chain of custody, without a 16-year-old being interrogated alone into a false confession. She didn't get that.
And because she didn't get that, none of us, not her family, not the public, not the courts, can say with the kind of certainty this case demanded that we know exactly what happened on October 31st, 2005. That should bother all of us. It bothers me. Look, if you came into this video certain of something, I hope you're leaving it a little less certain. Not because certainty is bad, but because premature certainty in this case is exactly what produced the mess we're still living with 20 years later.
Teresa Halbach was a 25-year-old photographer who drove to do a routine job and never came home. Whatever happened to her, she deserved better than what followed. A better investigation, a cleaner process, a trial built on evidence that nobody could reasonably question. She didn't get any of that. And the least we can do, the bare minimum, is refuse to flatten her into a symbol or a plot point, and acknowledge that the questions this case left open are not conspiracy theories.
They're just questions. Questions a real investigation should have answered. If you made it to the end, thank you for listening. If you want more deep-dive true crime stories told with detail and respect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. A new case is coming soon.